was one of those moments where you understand that the expression of love takes very many forms, and that he had been loving us before he knew he was dying, because he knew that he would. And that really taught me a lesson about that kind of very practical, placid, gentle acceptance that we're not immortal.
Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie couch with Sarah Perry. Sarah's the internationally best-selling author of novels including The Essex Serpent, Melmoth and Enlightenment, the latter of which was longlisted for the Booker Prize 2024. Her first full-length non-fiction book, Death of an Ordinary Man, tells of how she cared for her father-in-law during his final days, reflecting on how death can be met and understood as part of life. It is the winner of the Nero Book Award for non-fiction and has been longlisted for the Women's Prize for non-fiction. Sarah is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was appointed Chancellor of the University of Essex in 2023. She lives in Norwich. Sarah Perry, welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. I have a slight cold, but it's just given me an interestingly husky voice, so we'll be fine.
Good. Well, as you know, one of the aims of this podcast is to encourage conversations around death and dying and bereavement. And on that, I'm going to start straight away by asking if you've had a significant bereavement that you've experienced in your life you could talk about today.
I had bereavements of very elderly family members that didn't seem to me especially significant. Perhaps they should have done, but my grandmother was in her late 90s. So none of those things seemed kind of abruptions in the natural order. But in 2022, my father-in-law, David, who was only 77 and had been in good health as far as we were aware, died 9 days after a cancer diagnosis. And my husband and I had to be his carers. We immediately moved in because the speed of his illness and the rapidity of his dying was so extraordinary that social work and the NHS couldn't put measures in place sort of fast enough. And so it fell to us, and it was life-changing. Yeah.
Could we just go back to the sort of day where you and your husband found out about his dad's illness? I mean, were you with him? Did he contact you and tell you about it?
It's a really interesting process because something almost supernatural happened, which is that we lived close to each other and we were good friends and we had a lot of fun. So, we in the late September, 2 months before he died, we'd gone to the circus at Yarmouth and we'd eaten loads of fish and chips and donuts, and he'd laughed his head off at the circus and it was really wonderful. And then about 2 weeks after that, maybe 3 weeks, we'd arranged to go and have afternoon tea as a treat. His treat, he wanted to buy us afternoon tea at his favourite place in Norwich. And my husband and Robert and I were waiting for him outside the beautiful department store where we always met. And the last time I'd seen him, he'd been laughing and eating fish and chips and donuts, and he'd just been himself. And I saw him coming towards me through the crowd, and I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was dying. And I couldn't really tell you why. I just knew. The transformation was absolutely astonishing. And I just thought, he's dead. And I don't mean eventually. I mean, I knew in my heart of hearts that he had weeks left, if that. And so we encouraged him to go to the doctor. He'd been to the doctor during the summer because he'd been very tired, but we'd had the 40-degree heat wave. So we would speak on the phone and say, gosh, we're all exhausted. This is awful. I don't want to do anything. He'd had changes to his sense of taste, and the GP, quite reasonably under the circumstances, said, you've probably had COVID. It's changed your sense of taste. But no cough, no bleeding, none of those symptoms that we associate with cancer. But we just knew that he was gravely, gravely ill. So we encouraged him to go to the doctor. And there was a series of tests, endoscopy and so on. And they found what they called a growth. And they said, there's something there, we'll test it. And all along at the meetings with doctors that I was with, that my husband was with, at no point did they say cancer or tumour or grades or metastases. The language was all very kind of gentle and very nurturing almost. And then 9 days before he died, I went with him to hospital to get the results of the biopsy. And on that day, he'd rapidly become virtually unable to walk. Not totally, and it passed, it would come and go. And I thought, yeah, my premonition was correct. And we went to go and see the consultant, and he just said, there is a growth, the growth has spread, it's all through your body, you're too weak for chemotherapy or radiation. And then they said, so we're moving you on to palliative care. And then they spoke about the possibility of having a stent fitted. So it was esophageal cancer. But we didn't really see those words or hear those words until later on when we were looking over his letters, that it wasn't said in the meeting. And then he lived just under 9 days. He died in the small hours, so it was 8 days really.
And it is an extraordinary story because it is very rare, I think, certainly in my experience, that a diagnosis happens so late and then the death happens so quickly as well. And can I ask about that conversation as well in the sort of consultancy room? Because I think that's a really important one, that listeners for sure will have experienced. We hear lots of it where it's just not very clear. And so, I just wonder, how do you think for your father-in-law and for you and your husband, that conversation could have been more helpful?
It's such an interesting reflection and an interesting question, because my father-in-law was only 77 and had no physical or mental health problems until then. And he was a chemist. So he was a very clever man with a background in chemistry. I don't have a medical education, but, I'm sort of relatively well read and able to understand things. And the way we were spoken to, I can see as being handled with extreme care. Extreme care. For example, we were waiting in the waiting room. And of course, as everybody knows, in NHS hospitals, you go and check in like checking in for a flight. And there's sort of very overworked, very often women, people at the desk, and they're checking you in. And he, by then, very rapidly was unable to even find the letter that he needed to give. So I handed it over. And the woman at the reception of the ward saw something in me, glanced over to David, and her whole demeanour changed. And it became incredibly gentle and caring. And I think she must have spoken to somebody, because we waited a matter of less than a minute, I would say. And then the consultant himself came out of his room, headed straight for us, and insisted on wheeling David into the consultant room himself. So these are tiny human moments of very pressed professionals understanding that somebody was very, very gravely ill. When the consultant and the nurses were presented with David and myself, they have no way of knowing our level of education, our level of confusion. David looked very elderly by then. They weren't to know that a month before he hadn't looked particularly elderly. And so I feel that with some justification, medical professionals aim for the lowest common denominator, because you can't sort of begin to address everybody as if they've got, further degrees in chemistry and are able to grasp these things. But there is a risk of that creating an obfuscation and a confusion. And it's not for me to say, because I can't speak for David, whether a more direct form of communication would have been better for him. But I do know that in the days that followed, with other encounters with medical professionals, it swung the other way into brutality. So finding some kind of middle ground, I suppose, is the ideal.
Did David ever talk about death and dying? Did he ever talk about his own death before all of this?
No, not before all of this, because he was so young, you see, and he was never ill. You know, he spent a whole lifetime never being ill. He had a hip replacement, but he wasn't ill, and then he just died. So conversations about death and dying would never have come up about himself. His wife, my mother-in-law Jenny, had died 10 years before he did. She had had a disability, and her death had been quick and abrupt, but also to an extent expected because she'd been disabled all her adult life. And the only time we really talked about death was when Robert, my husband, my father-in-law and me were standing at Jenny's graveside, and we're a very undemonstrative family, and David put his arm through mine and he patted my arm, and I said, "Dad, could we all just agree we're not going to do this for a really long time?" And he said, "Yes, absolutely, we'll agree." And that was kind of it. But then when we came home from that appointment, the enormous weakness and exhaustion that had overtaken him receded, and he sat on the sofa with me with our whippet between us, tanking a cup of tea, talking about it all. And he just said, "Yeah, well, that's a bit sooner than I expected." And we talked about the fact that it might be another couple of years because we had no idea it was 9 days. And we joked about his savings, and I said, "You know, we can get you a robot butler, Dad. You can have anything you like." So he did understand. He did understand. And he was just terribly British about it.
Mm. And had he made any sort of practical arrangements, either before that or, I mean, I'm guessing probably not, you don't have much time, do you, in 9 days, but, with regards to a will or a funeral?
Yeah, it was amazing. So no arrangements for his funeral, but his love for us was so evident because he'd obviously been thinking about the fact that he had one child and two, because we've been married for so long. I was his daughter. He had a son and a daughter-in-law, but no wife and no other dependents, and that death would eventually come. So towards the end, we found a ring-bound notebook, and he'd written on it something like, "Where everything is, a beginner's guide." And he'd written inside it all of his passwords and all of his accounts of various things and how to log into his water and electricity and insurance and all of this stuff. And he had a will. And it was one of those moments where you understand that the expression of love takes very many forms, and that he had been loving us before he knew he was dying because he knew that he would. And that really taught me a lesson about that kind of very practical, placid, gentle acceptance that we're not immortal, and that a little notebook telling your loved ones what your password for your electricity account is an incredibly generous thing.
Yeah, it's really generous. I mean, very helpful. And, but yeah, very generous. I was going to ask, how did you keep up to speed in those 9 days? But I thought, well, that's a ridiculous question because you can't.
Mhm.
So what was going on for you in those 9 days? What do you recall about them?
The thing that I recall most of all, and the thing that I have said to people over and over and over again, is you think you can't do it. It sounds monstrous. It sounds insane. But you absolutely can. If you have to, not only can you, but you realise you are equipped to. And I truly believe that there is something base and atavistic and essential in us all to be able to shepherd someone out at the end of life. We are so accustomed to hearing stories of a woman saying, "I went into labour in the back of the cab and the cabbie delivered the baby." Right? We hear these things because there's a sense that, yes, actually, presented with a woman in labour, you probably would know what to do. You're not going to just leave her there, are you? You'll help. And it's exactly the same when the process of dying begins. Something happens to you where it's simultaneously monstrous and unbelievable and frightening, but at the same time very domestic and very ordinary. So if you are presented with somebody who suddenly cannot walk or is suddenly incontinent or cannot lift a glass of water, what do? You slip your arm under theirs to help them to the toilet and you hold up the glass of water to their lips. You absolutely can do it. And so I remember those days of my husband and I juggling every conceivable human emotion because I was endlessly on the phone pleading for help. And it wasn't that help wasn't forthcoming. It's just the minute they gave X amount of help, he had completely declined. So you needed Y and then you needed Z. But pleading for help, phoning for incontinence pads, running out to try to fulfill a prescription, cradling him in our arms because he was falling out of bed, trying to come to terms with the fact that he was refusing food because he was dying, not because he didn't feel well. And so it seems like an impossible contradiction in terms that something can be so devastating and so overwhelming, but also so normal and so domestic. But that is what it felt like.
And so instinctive and so there's something, because when you were talking, I was thinking about, oh, well, we don't know how resilient we are, until we're kind of faced with something and we
Yeah.
don't know what we've got in our resilience tool bag. But actually what you're describing is some of that, I guess, but also it's just about that instinctive stuff as well. There's something kind of human and instinctive about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, and there's plenty of time to talk about this in due course, but I would say that what's missing from us is not the instinct and not the capacity and not the humanity, but the ritual and the shared stories. That's what made it hard. So what made it so difficult and so strange was that it seemed outlandish because it had never really been spoken about before. It didn't seem outlandish because he was dying, which is a very subtle distinction. But I think again of the analogy of a woman in labour. I've never helped delivered a baby or seen a woman in labour. And were I ever in that situation, it would be like overwhelming and frightening and extraordinary. But it wouldn't be outlandish because we're all familiar with what labour looks like. Whereas with death, the way that we approach it and don't approach it, you're dealing with a kind of cultural taboo and a lack of experience at the same time as this extraordinary event. So you're left kind of comfortless in a way.
And that kind of fear of it, and people who, we hear comments like, I mean, I hear them all the time, certainly in my work, but hear those comments like, well, it's just part of life, or those jokes like, death and taxes. And yet it's not talked about. I mean, in hospice care, so I don't right now, but I've worked in hospices where, not everyone comes to a hospice to die. People come to hospices for care, when they're living with a terminal illness, and there's a whole range of different care and support services. But some people do come to die, and some people do come in the last kind of days, hours, and weeks of their lives. And often, really often, many of the people I've met, families and the person who's dying, come into the hospice to die, and no one's mentioned it. No one's had a conversation about it, like at all. And I was interested when you said earlier about you mentioned the word brutal, and I just kind of wondered what that was in those 9 days, and I wondered whether where that had come from. Was that from healthcare professionals being inappropriate?
Yeah, it absolutely was. The day after his diagnosis, so he insisted on going home the night he was diagnosed. He was like, no, I just want to go home. And he was in his own mind. He was laughing and joking, and we'd had a hug, and he'd had a cup of tea and some ice cream, and he lived nearby. So somewhat against our instincts, we let him go home. And I said, look, I'm checking in on you in the morning. So first thing in the morning, I went round to the bungalow where he lived. The door was unlatched because, it's the outskirts of Norwich, it's very safe. I went in, and there was no answer when I called. And he was toppled over on the side, in the bed, lying on one side, holding his favourite magazine as if it were a toy. And he hadn't undressed. This is very unlike David. I'd never seen him in a vulnerable state before because he was a man of 77. There was no need for me to see him in a vulnerable state. And the instinct that I had that day that he was dying came back to me. And it was weird because I was battling the optimism of the doctors who all said, he'll have the stent fitted and he'll be able to eat and it'll make a huge change and he'll really rally. And I'm thinking, no, but he's dying. He's really dying. I just know he is. I can't back it up. I just know he is. And I saw him on the bed and I was like, I knew it. I should have told them. I should have said, no, he's got days left. And so I thought, well, I don't know what to do. I can't, I'm not strong enough to pick him up. My husband that was the last day of my husband working away from the home. So it was the last day that I was on my own. But I thought, I'm not strong enough to pick him up. He's quite a big bloke at that point. I don't know if he's in pain, he's confused. I don't know what I should be feeding him. So I managed to get through to his GP and I asked for a house call. And anyone who's tried to get through to any GP in this day and age know that, are you asking for the moon on a stick? The idea of asking for a house call is absolutely outrageous. But I managed to get through and I said, he's just been diagnosed with cancer yesterday and they've put him on the palliative care pathway. But of course, less than 24 hours had passed. So there was no paperwork, there was nothing. So eventually I got a phone call from a GP and she was in such a temper. And she just said to me, oh, this keeps happening. And I just thought, oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. And then she came round at about 6:00 with not the merest shred of softness or of understanding our shock. And I think she must have thought that we'd known for months and that we hadn't bothered to do anything about it, because her behaviour was like we were school children who hadn't done our homework. And I'd managed to get David to sit up and he was extremely confused. He'd become very childlike, which was really odd for someone who could argue about politics for sort of 3 hours on the flat. And he sat next to me and this doctor waved around the respect form, which of course you'll be familiar with, but it's the form where you set out your last wishes. And she said, well, have you filled this in? And I said, I don't know what it is. And she said, oh, for goodness sake, it's a respect form. And then she said, right, David, imagine you fall out of bed and you're sort of, you're on your back and you're out of bed over there by the window and the ambulance comes, right? Do you want them to kind of like bring you back? And then you just go all blue lighted to hospital, or do you want to just be left here? Well, and he looked at me like she was speaking a foreign language. And I had to mediate between this apparently infuriated GP and say very gently, Dad, I think what she's saying is about resuscitation. So if you go into cardiac arrest or whatever, would you like to have CPR? And I had to say to him, that can be quite brutal. It doesn't always work. And then you would have to go into... And he said, no, I don't want to be interfered with. Just leave me here. And she just went, right, DNR, tick. As if it was just extraordinary. And that was the moment when I suddenly realised that my world had changed irrevocably, because I was mediating between this woman and this man about how and where he would end his life. And the enormity of that was so astounding to me. And when she left, she slightly softened when she realised that he'd only been diagnosed recently, with hours before. But then she left and she said, oh, I'm going on holiday tomorrow. Do you know I haven't even packed yet? And then she left. And then I was left with this bewildered, dying man. And I think it's good for all of us to dispense with bitterness or anger. It doesn't serve you. And I also think it's wrong and that we should try not to do wrong. But it took me a long time not to be angry with her and to understand how she could have been that way, like that.
And I'm so sorry that you and David experienced that, and it's a lesson in how not to do it. And that those conversations, regardless of what was going on for that professional in that moment at that time, and or the system in which they were clearly part of and frustrated by, which can be a very frustrating system. But regardless of all of that, both of you deserved a very, very different approach in that moment, and I'm sure you're not alone as well, Sarah, in that experience. And so just to kind of reiterate that respect form, and when we use words like DNAR for anybody listening, so that's when we're talking about whether, what wishes people want when they're living with a terminal illness, if they were to suddenly become acutely well? Would they want to be resuscitated? And then there's another conversation, and that's why those conversations happen with medical professionals, because it's like, well, what would be the benefits of having that for somebody who's dying and so gravely ill? Are there any? Yeah, just needs to be a very, very sensitive conversation. And I think also what we know in our work is, not everybody who works in health and social care feels comfortable having those conversations as well. And so, we know that people need to be trained and supported in having those conversations as well. I was reminded of when my dad was dying, and of course, I've been party to these conversations and part of them in my professional life, but I was there as a son, and me and my dad had had some of these conversations. So we invited the district nurses. They were coming to the house, and so him and I were on one side of the room and they were on the other side of the living room. And my dad had said to me beforehand, you start the conversation, you kind of bring it up. And so we'd kind of planned it before they'd arrived.
Yeah.
And I remembered saying, oh, my dad and I want to talk about death and dying today. And we want to talk about the respect form and DNAR. And I could see both of their faces. They completely clammed up, they were really scared. And so I just kind of facilitated gently this conversation to support them as well as my dad. And they contacted us afterwards, and said how helpful it had been as well. Because one of them had been party to a conversation like that before, but the other one hadn't, and she was relatively new on the job. And yeah, but none of that excuses the experience, you had. Can I just ask Sarah about David's death? So was he at home when he died in the end, or was he somewhere else?
So he wanted to stay at home and we facilitated that. So a hospital bed was sent, I think, on day 3. And by day 4, they had sent carers who came twice a day. And I think by day 5 or 6, we had a night carer. But for the first 5 days, it was just us with carers twice a day. And the district nurses who were absolutely extraordinary. There's a red-headed district nurse who, I bless his name. I can't remember his name, but I think about him and I thank God for him. He was just extraordinary. And the carers were extraordinary. And there were so many moments of connection and coincidence that will live with me forever. So nobody seemed able or willing to be direct with me about the fact that he was dying and he was dying fast. I knew out of some kind of ancient wisdom that he was. And there were only 2 people who were able to be direct with me. A good friend of ours who's a senior oncologist, and I was texting him and speaking with him on the phone throughout. And I got very distressed. So this was esophageal cancer, so eating was difficult, and they were supposed to fit a stent to open up the food pipe so that he could eat better. And they kept saying he'll rally as soon as he can get some nutrition. You'll see, people live for months and months and months after having a stent fitted. And I just thought, he's too weak to go to hospital. I don't even know how we'd get him in the car. This is absurd. And it was our doctor friend who gave us the courage to contact the hospital and say he will not be having this stent fitted. It's, refusing treatment effectively. And then I became very distressed and said, but he can't eat. So he's dying because he can't eat. And my doctor friend said, no, he's not eating because he's dying. And these are the kinds of things, these are the practical things that people need to know about death. And that's why I wrote this book, why I have these conversations. It's what we would have known throughout the whole duration of human history. A middle-aged woman would have known that for days and days, maybe even weeks before death, you begin dying. It has a long duration. Obviously, there's kinds of death that are very sudden and very abrupt, but the kinds of deaths that we're talking about, they have a duration, and you don't need to eat. When you're dying, you don't need to eat. So you don't want food, and you shouldn't make a dying man eat. It's not fair. They don't need it. And then they will refuse water, and somebody can refuse water for days beforehand, and that's perfectly normal. You're not denying them something. They don't need it. They're dying. And so all of these processes And then the death rattle starts, and that's fine. It's not distressing for them. It's surprisingly loud, but Buscopan can help with that. All of these very practical things. Once you know about them, they're not frightening. They're no more frightening than labour pains. And so we saw the process of death over those 8 or 9 days very up close and largely alone, for the first 4 or 5 days alone. And then slowly there was the gathering as engines were put into place and more carers were sent. And my parents accompanied us, staying elsewhere, but coming to the house for 2 or 3 days. And I should also say, I think it's very, very important to note that he was a man with a very quiet but very sincere faith. And I think that's a vital part of that story. So his pastor came. And I would just... it's fascinating to me that those healthcare professionals found it very difficult for you and your father to have that conversation about death. And I suppose it's very possible that certainly the younger one or the less experienced one didn't know what death looked like. And if you don't know about something, it is terrifying. Whereas I now have no fear of death at all. I mean, of course, there's types of death I fear. But if I die in, so to speak, the natural way of a terminal illness or of old age, I know what it will look like, and it's removed that fear for me, and it's no longer taboo for me to talk about it any more than it is to talk about childbirth.
Yeah, thank you for saying all of that. It's so true as well. I think that thing about it's different once we've experienced it. But also, so, having the information and being armed with the information about the dying process can really take the sting out of it as well. Of course, it's not to say that it's not going to be difficult, incredibly difficult and painful and all of those things. But actually, when you know what's happening and you understand what's happening, then you can have a different experience. And I think just, for anybody listening, I'd kind of direct anyone to our website, mariecurie.org.uk. We've got a whole range of not just written resources on there about the dying process, but we have videos where staff members explain about the dying process. We have videos and resources which are made for people who take information in different ways, somebody with learning disabilities, for example. So, please do check it out, because I think it's really, really important what you're saying, isn't it? It's kind of, if you're armed with the information, you only had 9 days to do it as well. But if you're armed with some of that information, it can be very, very helpful.
Marie Curie's mission is to close the gap in end-of-life care. We're here for anyone with an illness they're likely to die from, and those close to them. Whatever the illness, wherever you are, we're with you to the end. Find out more at mariecurie.org.uk.
Could we talk a bit about bereavement and grief and your experience of that, Sarah, after David died?
I think there's an important distinction between the loss of a parent and loss of a parent-in-law. So I noticed very much the difference between myself and my husband, who I don't want to speak for too much. I can only say what I observed. So I lost somebody who was my second father and who I'd known since I was 13. So, he was, my husband and I were childhood sweethearts. So,
I love that.
The dog has just come in. Go on, Ruby, go on.
She's gorgeous. Hi, Ruby.
Yeah, good girl. She was lovely with David. We'd only adopted her about a month before David began to die. And he didn't like dogs, but he loved our dogs. We had a whippet as well at the time, and they just knew something was happening. And we had to move into the bungalow to care for David. And they just lay either side of his legs on the bed, and they just wouldn't move. And he would just sort of rest his hand on it. It was extraordinary. So when it comes to talking about bereavement, I think one of the things that I think is really important for people to acknowledge is that it is unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable. Even when you've seen it happen, you cannot believe that a human being containing all their foibles and their silly jokes and the way they wear their trousers and the fact that they grow certain vegetables every summer and the way their hair sits and their laugh and everything that makes them totally particular has just gone. It's inconceivable. And I can remember 3 or 4 days after he died, walking the dogs at night and stopping dead in the middle of the street and saying, Dad's dead. He's dead. He's died. He's actually died. And I just couldn't fathom it. And so there was this disbelief and then this curious sense that he wasn't really dead because we kept talking about him. And what's the difference between talking about somebody who is absent because they're in their bungalow and you're in your house and talking about someone who's absent because they're dead? In both cases, they're not in the room and you're talking about them and thinking about them. So there was a curious sense of loss but not loss. I do think that the loss of a biological parent has a profundity and a weirdness that I have not experienced yet. Both my parents are still alive. And I think for Robert, there was a sense of a loss of connection in a kind of line, in a kind of bloodline. You know, this is a very ordinary family. We're not talking about the Duke of Kent, but, you know, the memories and the things that made him him had been severed. And so then there's an impact on your own identity. You're partly your father and your mother, and they're dead, and your grandparents are dead. So in what way do you exist? But I think I've given this advice to people before. When someone begins to die, when somebody, perhaps particularly a parent, becomes very, very ill, there is something very important that you must say to yourself, which is that from now on, I'm going to live and act in such a way that when they have died, I needn't berate myself and needn't feel guilty. Because Robert said to me once, I'm going to be a good son now, and I want to be a good son after he's dead. And that's such a powerful thing to say to yourself, that you, in the aftermath, God willing, you could look back and say, I was a good son, or I was a good daughter, or I was a good nurse. And it really helps with, you know, your own temper. And I used to get really cross because I was desperately trying to phone someone because we needed morphine and no one was answering the phone and someone was being an idiot. You know, I would get really bad tempered and didn't clean my teeth for 5 days or change my clothes or, you know, anything like that. And then we would just stop abruptly and say, we need to be able to look back and not think, why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? And that's quite a powerful imperative. You're thinking of your own bereaved self. You know, how can I care for the self that will exist after this? And one of those things is by acting in a way that seems to you to be right.
Brilliant advice. I mean, absolutely. You know, I think just that kind of thinking about having some insight into what might come afterwards with regards to kind of my feelings and what might I be able to do now, you know, to help myself with some of that later on. And I think that, you know, your use of the word good, and I think I had similar experiences myself personally, but I think there's also there's a whole gambit of stuff, really, isn't there? I'm just thinking about families and relationships and family dynamics. And you know, putting differences aside and trying to come together and all of those things as well. I think if, you know, of course, it's sort of easy to say right now when I'm sitting in a room talking into a microphone, and the reality is very different when you're in the middle of it. As you'd said, days go by and you don't even either think about and or have opportunity to clean your teeth. Your focus, your mind, everything is completely elsewhere. It's out of the ordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think being able to, as you both did with each other, being able to take those moments to stop and say, you know, what might help us later on.
And I think definitely there's a sense of, you suddenly realise this is so trite, but sometimes things are trite because they're true. When you're watching a human soul leave the earth, things just don't seem important anymore. And it's changed my relationships, certainly my familial relationships, and tempered my impatience and tempered my judgmentalism and tempered my sin, so to speak, because it's so brief. You know, this little life contracted to a span. It's so brief. And the idea that I might harbour grudge, bitterness, or anger when I could be blown out like a candle at any point seems to me absurd. And so the experience of bereavement can be very transformative in all kinds of ways. And again, I'm really conscious that I'm talking about the death of a man in his 70s. I can't speak about those very traumatic, unnatural deaths, like the death of a child, the death of a partner. And I wouldn't for a moment try to extend what I've learned to those kinds of loss, which I know nothing about and do fear. But those losses which are inevitable and in the natural order, I think can be a good tutor and teach you how to live and eventually teach you how to die.
Thank you. I just want to change tack slightly, and I want to ask if you ever think about your own death.
Oh, all the time. Yeah. Now, I'm going to say something that sounds absolutely absurd, but I'm sort of looking forward to it. Now, this is not the same as wanting to die. I intend to die at 103, right? But firstly, I have a faith. Now, I quite often describe myself as being simultaneously the world's worst atheist and the world's worst Christian, right? So I live in this space where, like, my rational mind, it's like, well, this is all there is. We're matter, we're material, we're particles, but there is something in me that kind of lives in this faith, kind of this very deep, unshifting spiritual life. And I was interviewed recently and someone said, what will happen when you die? And I immediately went and said, oh, I'm going to glory. And I was like, oh, I didn't realise I thought that. So that's really important to say. When I think about death, you cannot unlatch that from your theology and philosophy, whatever it is, whatever that looks like. They're so intimately entwined. And I think there's now two reasons why I think about my own death in a relatively positive way. One of them is having a faith, and the other one is not being afraid of the procedure and the process of death. So because I now know what it may well look like, because one of the things that you find out when you talk about dying is that it looks really similar. So I used to get really exasperated with David before his final diagnosis, before we knew how ill he was. He just wouldn't eat. And I kept trying to get him to eat, and it's like, oh, I don't fancy it. And I was so frustrated. And then while I was writing the book, I researched famous deaths. And there was an account of Elizabeth I lying on a pile of cushions and refusing to eat, and all her courtiers being really fed up with her because she was dying. She didn't need food. She was dying. And there's something very consoling about understanding that it's this very leveling shared experience that, if there is an afterlife, there's lots of people going, oh, did you stop eating about 3 weeks before? Yeah, me too. And then someone will pipe up and go, it's 4 for me, actually. But we can't do that. We can't talk about our own deaths. So instead, we need to talk about the deaths that we've seen. And it fundamentally changes your experience of it. The only thing that troubles me about dying is leaving my husband behind. Everything else is fine.
Thank you. And, I was just reminded there of a man I was talking to who was in the last couple of weeks of his life, and he was getting frustrated because his family kept trying to get him to eat. And because, of course, what we know is for family members, then, when you're sitting watching somebody who's dying, that feeling of complete and utter helplessness that you just don't know what to do with it, then you want to kind of feed someone, I think that's an instinctive response as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And but he said, I've told them that it's been 2 weeks now. He said, and I would describe it. It's like it was literally. He said it was like a bird. He said, and my appetite just flew away one morning. He said, and it's just gone.
Yeah. It's so interesting, and there is something so deeply rooted in us that somebody needs our care and we want to care for them, they're not eating. And what I would say is what we discovered is I'm so sorry to sound sentimental, but if you can't be sentimental about this, then where are we? You just love them. Just love them. Whoever it is, you just love them. And if you allow yourself to do that, you find there are things that you could do. Now, we are a very undemonstrative family. He was a working class man from Basildon, right? We did not call each other darling, you know. We occasionally expressed affection by a light punch on the shoulder or a nudge, you know, but we loved him. And no, you can't feed them, but you can call them sweetheart, and you can stroke their hair, and you can hold their hand when they get agitated, and you can sing to them, and you can stroke their hand while someone's giving them an injection. You can do all of those things. And one of the things that I found really extraordinary was that it just became so easy to love him in that way, in a way that just 5 days before I couldn't have imagined kissing his forehead and singing him a hymn. It would have been absurd. But when someone's dying, you're not embarrassed, ideally. And so what's lacking, I think, is permission, people feeling permission to do that. And all of those little rituals that we used to have around the death watch. So I used to think the death watch was that you were sitting up with the dead body, and it's not. You're sitting up with the dying. That's the death watch. You're watching the death. Other cultures have things that they might do, candles they might light, songs that they might sing, and they allow you to express love because you can't make them eat.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I just feel very moved by that as well. Is legacy something that's important to you, as in how you'd like to be remembered?
It really is. And I'm a writer first and foremost. And so I just want to leave books behind me. And when I write, I think I don't have children by choice. And I think that for me, the impulse that very many people, particularly women, have to make their mark, to leave something behind them. Obviously, lots and lots of people are writers and parents, so you don't have to choose, but I felt I had to choose. My legacy is pouring everything that I have felt, experienced, seen, wondered, learnt into my books. And one of the great things about writing about David is that although I have no regrets about having no children, I did occasionally think, where are David's jokes going to go? Because he was effortlessly funny. And he didn't have any grandchildren to remember his jokes, but I've put them in the book. So we might have had 2 or 3 children and they would remember Granddad's jokes, but now thousands of people are laughing at David's jokes. And that makes me really happy.
I love that. That's great. And is there anything you wanted to say today on the podcast that I've not asked you about?
I don't think so. I think this is it. This conversation is it. And this is what needs to happen. And I feel that I would like to contribute to conversations that might change the culture. None of us can do it on our own, but imagine if it was possible for a man to go down the pub and say to his friends, Mum's incontinent now, by the way. And then for someone to say, I can recommend exactly the incontinence pants that you need. No embarrassment, you know. Imagine if it was that normal that somebody was dying. But the other thing that I want to say is something really serious and of deep political importance, I think, which is this. How can people make decisions about their treatment and their care and their manner of dying when they don't know about death? And I suspect that fear of death and dread of dying doesn't equip people to make an informed choice about what's happening to them. So I can only speak for myself and for intimates that I've spoken to. But were I to be diagnosed with a very late stage diffuse cancer, I know that my decisions now, having seen death, are very different from what my decisions would have been like before. And endlessly attempting to forestall the unknown, because death is an unknown taboo quantity that nobody talks about, by opting for treatment after treatment after treatment, possibly out of fear, is what has contributed to the taboo, because it creates the kind of death industrial complex, right? You die in hospital under bright lights alone because you're having lots and lots of treatments. And I applaud and I'm grateful for all of the progress that we've made in medicine, and particularly in cancer medicine. And I think it's extraordinary. But there must be a time when patients need to know that they're dying and ideally know what death looks like so that they can then make a properly informed choice.
My last question, how has it been today being on the Marie Curie couch?
Great, thank you. Because I just want to, I want to talk about it all of the time because it feels, I said to somebody the other day, if I never write another book, which I will, but say I were never to write another book, I feel like a soldier that could stand down from his post. It was worth all my years of writing and all my years of training to have the ability to write that book. And I feel that it has made my presence here on this extraordinary planet of ours worthwhile if people can read that book and be comforted about their own death and about the death of people they love. And so I'm really grateful that you gave me the opportunity to talk to more people about it.
Yeah, well, Sarah Perry, thank you for joining me today on the Marie Curie couch. Thank you for sharing some of David's story and Jenny's. And it was also wonderful not only to meet you, but I also got to see Ruby the dog in the background.
Yeah, the famous
as well.
Ruby. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
It's a pleasure.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, you can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye.